The moment a family stops pretending that its sins can still be managed, contained, or polished into something respectable, everything begins to rot in plain sight. In Genoa City, power had always worn an expensive suit, spoken in a calm voice, and hidden its brutality behind polished boardroom tables and carefully staged loyalty. But this time the damage could not be disguised by wealth, reputation, or legacy. This time the violence was not only emotional, not only strategic, not only buried under layers of old resentment, it had crossed into blood. It had crossed into murder. And at the center of that storm stood three men shaped by the Newman Empire in different ways, each of them collapsing under the weight of rage, pride, fear, and revenge, while those around them were left to confront the terrifying truth that no one in this war would come out clean. Billy had told himself for years that he was different from the men he hated, different from Victor with his cold authoritarian instincts, different from the people who treated weakness as an opportunity, different from the predators who crushed lives and called it strategy. Yet bitterness had a way of changing its host from the inside out, especially when it was fed long enough. What began as resentment had slowly evolved into obsession, and obsession had now sharpened itself into something far uglier. Billy no longer wanted to simply beat Victor in business or embarrass him in public. He wanted Victor removed from the board completely, permanently. The deeper he fell into that dark conviction, the more he convinced himself that he was not becoming a monster but correcting an old injustice that everyone else had been too weak to stop. That lie became easier to believe once he discovered something dangerous about Phyllis, something explosive enough to destroy her if it ever came to light, something tied to choices she had made in desperation and pride, choices that would leave her isolated and disgraced if the truth surfaced. Billy saw the secret not as information but as leverage, and once he held that leverage in his hands, he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Phyllis had always lived closest to the fire. She understood manipulation, she understood survival, and she understood what it meant to gamble everything on a move that could either save her or ruin her forever. But even she was unprepared for the cold precision with which Billy cornered her. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His threat carried a kind of calm that was more frightening than open fury. He forced her into a corner where every possible choice felt like a slow death. If she refused him, her secret would detonate and take whatever remained of her fragile standing with it. If she obeyed him, she would become complicit in something unforgivable. The man before her was not the reckless, damaged Billy who acted out of pain and then spiraled into regret. This version was colder, more methodical, more terrifying because he had taught himself to call cruelty necessity. He framed Victor's death as a grim solution to a corrupt problem, as though murder could somehow restore moral balance. In his mind, Victor had ruined too many people, controlled too many lives, poisoned too many futures. In Billy's twisted logic, forcing Phyllis to do what he himself could not do was not cowardice, but strategy. That was the part that sickened her most. Billy was willing to stain her soul to keep his own hands seemingly clean. He used her vulnerability as a weapon and expected her to carry the final burden. Phyllis felt humiliated by the trap, enraged by the hypocrisy, and deeply unsettled by the ugly recognition that she had spent so many years operating in moral gray zones that people now assumed she was capable of anything. Her own past had built the cage around her. Every reckless scheme, every selfish move, every betrayal that she had justified as survival now returned like a debt collector. She hated Billy for weaponizing her history, but part of her also hated herself for making his threat believable. That self-loathing began to mix with panic. She found herself thinking not only about Victor, but about how all her failures had converged into this one horrifying moment. She had wanted influence, relevance, control. Instead, she had become the perfect target for coercion. As Billy's pressure intensified, Phyllis began to crack in private. Outwardly, she still carried her sharpness, still tried to project calculation and pride, but inwardly, she was unraveling beneath the impossible weight of what she was being asked to do. Every path in front of her led to destruction. If Victor died, Genoa City would erupt in suspicion and retaliation, and she would spend the rest of her life wondering whether she had become the very thing her enemies always accused her of being. If Victor lived and Billy exposed her secret, she would lose any remaining trust she had clawed back. What made it worse was that Billy seemed to understand the psychology of her fear almost too well. He pushed with surgical cruelty, exploiting every insecurity, every wound, every old humiliation. He made her feel replaceable, disposable, already damned. The more he pressed, the more Phyllis's fear began to mutate into something dangerous. Not loyalty, not surrender, but a reckless need to survive at any cost. And when survival becomes the only principle left, people stop recognizing themselves. At the same time, far from Genoa City's familiar battlefields, Las Vegas became the stage for another disaster spiraling beyond control. Adam had gone there already carrying too much pressure, too much history, too many unresolved fractures hidden beneath his usual self-command. He had always walked a narrow line between confidence and self-destruction, between calculated boldness and emotional collapse. Vegas, with all its noise, temptation, and lawlessness, did not quiet the ghosts in his mind. It amplified them. He found himself pulled into a dangerous orbit surrounding a drug case that he had not intended to become part of, but intentions meant very little once law enforcement got involved and suspicion began to spread. Wrong place, wrong timing, dangerous associations, and a trail of bad judgment led to the kind of arrest that instantly strips away status and leaves only vulnerability behind. For a man like Adam, who built his identity on regaining control every time life tried to humiliate him, being handcuffed by the police in public was not just a legal crisis, it was psychological warfare. The arrest ignited something primal inside him. Shame hit first, then fury. He hated the officers, hated the chaos around the case, hated the possibility that his family would see this as yet another proof that he could never outrun his past. But beneath all of that was an even deeper fear that he would once again become the version of himself he had spent years trying to bury. Adam understood how quickly one scandal could destroy fragile progress. He had fought too hard to rebuild trust, too hard to present himself as stable, loyal, worthy of a place in the family without being viewed as a ticking time bomb. Now one arrest threatened to collapse that image completely. In the harsh, fluorescent atmosphere of custody, stripped of charm and momentum, Adam was forced to sit with his own anger in a way that felt almost unbearable. He thought of Victor, of the impossible standards that had shaped him. He thought of Chelsea, of every promise he had made. He thought of Nick and the old family pattern in which one son was always treated as damaged, while the other was expected to be dependable. The humiliation turned poisonous because it touched the deepest wound he carried, the fear that no matter how hard he tried, disaster would always find him, and people would always secretly expect it. Yet Adam's arrest did not happen in isolation. It fed directly into Nick's own collapse, because by then Nick was already operating on the edge of emotional control. His anger over Sharon had been building for too long, sharpened by helplessness and guilt. He had watched her suffer, watched her pay emotional prices for the cruelty of others, watched wounds reopen that never should have been touched again. In his mind, Matt was no longer just a threat or an enemy. He had become a symbol of everything festering and unresolved, a living embodiment of the damage done to Sharon and to anyone who had ever tried to protect her. Nick's need for justice slowly became indistinguishable from his need for vengeance. That distinction mattered at first. It stopped mattering the moment pain took over. There was a point when Nick could still have stepped back, still have trusted the law, still have chosen restraint. But grief mixed with masculine pride and protective rage can become a terrifying force, especially in a man who has spent years convincing himself he is more controlled than he really is. When Nick finally confronted Matt, it was not merely a showdown between two men. It was the collapse of every restraint Nick had been clinging to. The sight of Matt, the memory of Sharon's suffering, the accumulation of fear and frustration, all of it detonated at once. In that moment, Nick stopped being the steady son, the reasonable brother, the man who could see both sides. He became pure retaliation. The gun in his hand represented the final surrender to an emotion he had tried to master but had instead allowed to consume him. When he fired, the act itself was both explosive and strangely inevitable, as though months or years of unprocessed pain had finally found a brutal, irreversible release. Matt's death was not only a revenge killing. It was the moment Nick shattered his own moral self-image. The instant after the shot, victory did not arrive. Relief did not arrive. Only horror, adrenaline, and the sickening realization that he had crossed into territory from which there would be no clean return. What made the aftermath even more devastating was that Nick had done it in the name of love and loyalty. Two things he had always believed made him better than the people around him. He had told himself that his devotion to Sharon made his rage righteous. But once Matt lay dead, Nick was forced to confront the brutal emptiness behind that justification. Sharon had needed strength, not bloodshed. She had needed safety, not another crime committed in her shadow. Nick's revenge did not erase her pain. It only threatened to create a new prison around both of them. He felt the full contradiction almost immediately. He wanted to protect her, yet he had made himself the latest source of danger in her life. He wanted to honor what she had endured, yet he had responded by becoming violent in a way that could re-traumatize everyone involved. That moral whiplash began to tear him apart. He was furious at Matt, furious at the world, furious at every system that had failed Sharon, but increasingly furious at himself for allowing his love to mutate into something so destructive. The terrible symmetry of it all began to emerge quickly. While Billy tried to turn Phyllis into an instrument of murder, Nick had already become one. While Adam was being dragged into scandal and criminal suspicion in Las Vegas, his brother was creating a far worse criminal reality with his own hands. And looming above it all was Victor, the dark gravitational center of the family, the man whose influence shaped every violent impulse in his sons and enemies alike. Even when absent, Victor seemed to direct the emotional climate. Billy wanted him dead because Victor symbolized domination, humiliation, and the corruption of every conflict he touched. Adam's arrest became unbearable, partly because he knew Victor would interpret it through the harsh lens of disappointment and control. Nick's shooting of Matt carried the old Newman imprint as well, the instinct to solve danger through force, to end a threat decisively rather than endure vulnerability. In different ways, all three men were still reacting to Victor, still trying to defeat him, impress him, escape him, or avenge themselves against the damage of living in his orbit. Phyllis, meanwhile, realized that she was caught not just in Billy's scheme but in a much larger implosion. If Nick's act came to light, and Adam's case worsened, the entire balance of power in Genoa City would shift into chaos. The Newman family would close ranks in one direction, while turning on itself in another. Victor would become more dangerous, not less. Panic would create new alliances, new betrayals, new opportunities for destruction. She began to understand that Billy's plan was never just about revenge. It was about taking advantage of a moment when the whole structure around Victor was destabilizing. Billy wanted blood because blood would weaken the empire. That realization filled her with a different kind of terror. She was not just being blackmailed into a crime. She was being used as a piece in a larger campaign of collapse. If she acted, she would not only destroy Victor, she would trigger a chain reaction that could consume everyone. If she refused, Billy might decide she had become a liability and ruin her anyway. Under that pressure, Phyllis's internal war grew more savage. She oscillated between wanting to expose Billy, wanting to outmaneuver him, wanting to run, and wanting to strike first before he could destroy her. Her mind moved through darker and darker possibilities because fear had stripped away the luxury of idealism. She knew Billy expected panic. What he did not expect was how dangerous she could become when cornered. Yet even as that steel hardened inside her, there remained a raw emotional truth she could not escape. She was exhausted. Exhausted by always having to survive. Exhausted by men using her mistakes to control her. Exhausted by being feared, judged, and underestimated all at once. That exhaustion added another unstable layer to her thinking. Tired people make desperate decisions. Tired people stop believing in redemption and start believing only in immediate escape. Adam's crisis deepened in parallel. The arrest opened the door to more scrutiny, more suspicion, more questions about what he had known and when. Vegas had given him no room to breathe. Every face around him looked either opportunistic or condemning. He began replaying each step that had led him there, furious at himself for miscalculations, furious at the possibility that someone had set him up, furious at how easily his name could once again become associated with criminality. Yet beneath the anger there was a vulnerable, almost boyish humiliation that he could barely tolerate. Adam hated appearing weak. He hated needing help. He hated the thought of returning home not as a victor but as a man dragged back by scandal. The legal threat was real, but the emotional threat was even worse. He could feel old insecurities rising, old instincts telling him to lash out, lie, manipulate, burn bridges before anyone could judge him first. It took everything in him not to surrender to those reflexes. But control was slipping, and every hour made it harder to know whether he was fighting the situation or becoming it. Nick's deterioration was perhaps the most tragic, because his violence had come from a place he still wanted to call love. After Matt's death, he moved through a haze of shock and defensive rationalization. Part of him still insisted it had been necessary, that Sharon had suffered enough, that Matt would only have continued causing harm. But another part of him knew that explanation was already collapsing. Revenge had not restored dignity. It had not healed anything. It had only unleashed a new chain of dread. He could feel the walls closing in, not only legally but spiritually. Every protective instinct that once made him seem honorable now looked distorted in retrospect, as though all his best qualities had been corrupted by obsession. The guilt did not arrive cleanly. It came mixed with stubbornness, with fear, with flashes of remaining rage. That made him even more unstable. He was not repentant enough to confess, not cold enough to feel nothing, and not calm enough to plan clearly. He was trapped in the worst possible space, where conscience and self-preservation tear at each other until the mind begins to fray. As these parallel disasters accelerated, the emotional atmosphere surrounding the Newmans and their enemies turned poisonous. Trust eroded by the hour. Everyone seemed to sense that multiple catastrophes were unfolding at once, but no one yet knew how deeply they were connected. Billy kept tightening his hold over Phyllis, convinced that he was on the verge of engineering the ultimate downfall. Adam fought to keep his sense of self from collapsing under legal and familial pressure. Nick carried the fresh stain of murder, while telling himself he had acted for Sharon, even as that justification slowly decayed in his own mind. And over all of it hung the possibility that Victor, the intended target, would survive long enough to discover every betrayal aimed at him. If that happened, there would be no mercy. Victor did not forgive assassination plots, family disgrace, or weakness exposed at the wrong moment. He turned pain into strategy faster than anyone. The terrifying truth was that even before Billy's scheme had reached its endpoint, Victor was already winning in another sense. His enemies and sons were destroying themselves from within. This is what makes the collapse so devastating. None of these people began with entirely false motives. Billy's hatred of Victor had roots in real damage, but he allowed moral injury to evolve into homicidal obsession. Phyllis wanted to survive, but survival under blackmail threatened to erase the last boundaries she still believed in. Adam wanted to prove he was more than his worst history, yet the arrest forced him to confront how fragile that reinvention really was. Nick wanted justice for Sharon, but he let grief and fury mutate into an execution that may haunt him forever. Their motives were human. Their choices were catastrophic. That is the cruel design of this kind of war. No one wakes up wanting to become the darkest version of themselves. They arrive there one justification at a time, one humiliation at a time, one angry decision at a time, until suddenly they are standing in the ruins, unable to deny what they have done. And in the end, that is where this story becomes most dangerous. Not in the gunshot, not in the arrest, not even in the assassination order, but in the realization that each person now has to decide what kind of monster they are willing to become to survive what comes next. Billy has already sacrificed his conscience to revenge. Phyllis may soon have to choose between exposure and blood. Adam may decide that if the world insists on treating him like a criminal, he might as well stop fighting the label. Nick may either confess and lose everything, or keep running and lose himself in a slower, crueler way. The war around Victor has become more than a battle for dominance. It has become a test of whether any of them can still recognize the line between justice and vengeance, loyalty and possession, survival and moral death. In Genoa City, those lines have never stayed clear for long, but now they are vanishing altogether. And the people left standing at the edge of that darkness are not simply fighting their enemies. They are fighting the worst impulses that have lived inside them all along.